Good morning and welcome to the 18th meeting in 2013 of the Health and Sport Committee. As usual, can I remind those present to switch off mobile phones and Blackberries as they may interfere with the sound system. People in the public gallery may also notice that some members and officials are using iPads and this is instead of hard copies of their committee papers. The first item on the agenda is a decision to take items 4 and 6 in private. Item 4 is consideration of a letter to the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee, and item 6 is to consider the committee's approach to NHS Board's budget scrutiny. Our members agreed that items 4 and 6 taken in private. Thank you. We now move to agenda item number 2, support for community sport, which is a follow-up into our support for community sport publication of the report of our findings back in January this year. There is a strong focus today on volunteering. Can I welcome Shona Robison, Minister for Commonwealth Games and Sport. Welcome, Minister. She is accompanied by Donnie, Deputy Director of Sport and Physical Activity, Scottish Government. Welcome. And Stewart Harris, of course, Chief Executive, Sports Scotland. Welcome to you all. I think the Minister has got some remarks to make before we go to questions. Thank you, Minister.
Just very briefly, thanks, Convener. I feel a bit old-fashioned not having an iPad here, but stick with the paper for this morning. But it's a great opportunity just to explain to the committee in a bit more detail what we're doing to address the specific recommendation made around volunteering and coaching highlighted in your committee's report. I hope that the written submission was helpful and, of course, happy to answer any questions that you have on that subject. To help the committee, I'd like to highlight a couple of key points from what I believe is a very strong and positive story on volunteering and coaching development. I think we're all agreed that volunteers and coaches provide the backbone of our sporting infrastructure, and without their input it's fair to say that the whole of our club network would, I think, fall apart. The figures are quite amazing actually. 195,000 volunteers work in sport in Scotland, which in turn represents 4.5% of the Scottish adult population. And of this figure, more than 90,000 are coaches. And when you consider what this means in terms of time commitment alone, it's among the highest levels of voluntary contribution anywhere in Scottish society, and that's fantastic. But of course, it's right that we should concentrate our efforts in supporting and maintaining this high level of commitment. I'm very pleased with the range of interventions which Sports Scotland, working in partnership with the governing bodies, has put in place to tackle this, and details are set out in my submission. Sports Scotland has invested over £9 million in volunteering and coaching over the past 3 years, while local authorities also make a substantial investment. As the committee will be aware, the recruitment, retention and development of people volunteering in sport is a key part of Sports Scotland's commitment to the creation of a world-class sporting system at all levels in Scotland. Central to that is the volunteering framework, Volunteering in Sport 2011-15, which has been developed in conjunction with Volunteer Development Scotland. Alongside their partners, Sports Scotland is committed to supporting, encouraging and working with volunteers to grow sustainable approaches to the development of their skills and knowledge. This commitment also extends to ensuring ethical standards and inclusivity in sport, and I'm happy to inform the committee that work is well underway to ensure that these values are embedded throughout all aspects of the volunteering framework. I think it's fair to say that, as with so many aspects of sport, I firmly believe that we in Scotland are ahead of the game in terms of having in place not only the political commitment to support our volunteers and coaches, but also having a robust infrastructure which underpins this at a practical level. And again, there are examples of that in the submission. Direct support for club growth, the additional investment into individual sport clubs, and our plans for retaining volunteers provide, I believe, the right framework upon which we can build a more resilient and robust sporting sector. Just finally to say, I do recognise the challenges ahead. We're absolutely not complacent, But I do believe that the collaborative approach which Sports Scotland has adopted with the key partners will stand us in very good stead when it comes to meeting the challenges ahead and building for the future. Happy to take questions, Convener. Thanks,
Minister. Apart from I think the household study figures that you mentioned of the 4.5% of the population, what other work have we done to audit the figures that we have in terms of the level and numbers of volunteers?
Well, Sports Scotland does a lot of work, obviously, with governing bodies. We ask them to submit regular information about the activities within the club infrastructure in Scotland so that we know their position. The toolkit referred to in the submission will help us do that in a lot more depth, because what we're asking clubs to do is really to not only identify what they have in terms of resources, and obviously volunteers and coaches are an integral part of that, but also to begin to identify the gaps and what they require in order to grow their club infrastructure. So certainly the work with the governing bodies gives us a huge amount of information. Stewart, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Yep. I mean, as part of our work with each of the governing bodies on an annual basis, we'll have an action plan with each of them to look at what their aims are in terms of recruitment, retention, deployment. It's probably worth looking at how robust we've made our active schools monitoring as well, where we have over 15,500 deliverers in the active school system. And again, just reminded members that that covers every local authority and every school in Scotland, of which 84% are volunteers. Our data is much better now, and I think it gives us a platform to kind of spring forward from. Still a good time out from the games. This is about that world-class system that members will remember us talking about last year, where school, club and performance is important, but people and facilities will drive it.
I'm looking at the Sports Scotland response, and that's what I'm trying, in terms of burrowing down into Scottish figures. And a lot of the sports organisations, it's a lot of UK figures in terms of the male-female ratio, 75% coaches and whatever. And I'm wondering, if all of that work's been done, why that level of detail at a Scottish basis, which is of interest to this committee, has not been referred to in your response from Sports Scotland to the committee's inquiry?
In the end, the UK figures are very indicative. What we have done is we work with each of the sports convener to look at the breakdown in those figures. We are working now to improve the data. As I said before, we have done a lot of work on the data from active schools, and we'll continue to do more and more work ensuring that governing bodies can collect that data. Our job will be to amalgamate it and make sure, now that's always been difficult because there's been differing methodology in collecting that. We're now trying to make that much more consistent going forward, so that we can have a degree of that data. There is a lot of that detail around, and it can be broken down sport by sport.
But I mean, I'm just trying to get behind the 4.5, the 90,000 volunteers, the 13,000 clubs. But I mean, that has hit the household survey. You have not got anything else to share with us this morning.
Well, only what we've described in terms of the figures that underpin the work with the governing bodies, the active schools network, the community sports hubs, all of which are gathering in databases around usage, new members coming into sport. Probably what would be best, convener, is for us to share that new information with you when we've got it in a ready state, because you'll appreciate that quite a lot of the community sport hub information is quite new. So Sports Scotland have been doing a lot of work at drilling down, and what I could do is give you a commitment that over the next few months we'll come back to you with some new figures that might help to give you some of the detail that you're looking for beyond the figures that we've highlighted already, if that would be something that would be useful.
Minister, but this is something that we've been discussing with you and Sports Scotland since October 12th. The committee's report puts a big focus on understanding what capacity we have, and we'll come to the legacy later, because I think the committee gave their view that if we are to maximise on that legacy, then it will be delivered not by people in this room, but those people who You know, so if we are not at a stage where we've got that broken down, how do we know? How do we confirm these figures? How do we audit them? And how do we get an understanding about how many volunteers that we need to increase to ensure that legacy after the Commonwealth Games?
Well, part of the response to that is what I mentioned earlier on, the club self-improvement tool. A lot of work has gone on in the last year to have very direct support of the clubs. So traditionally, a lot of work going on with the governing bodies. The governing bodies obviously support the clubs. I think where this is different is a very direct relationship between Sports Scotland and the clubs, which has led to the club development support through the regional sporting partnerships, the direct club investment programme, which we haven't seen before, the club self-improvement tool to look at where the gaps are and where the capacity of clubs needs to be built up. All of that is part of, I suppose, the funding relationship with Sports Scotland through the various funds available. And in response to that, targets will be set with clubs around growth that they would expect to see within their club environment. So whether that's volunteers recruited, whether it's coaches developed, whether it's participants being brought in. So that is quite new. That wasn't the case previously. It was a bit more removed, the relationship between Sports Scotland and the clubs. That's now far closer. And the statistics that will be gained from that in terms of what's delivered through those arrangements will be very helpful, I think, to all of us in terms of seeing where the growth is.
So not yet, but we will be
well, I
having
think
some of
it's
this.
work in progress, I would say.
It's work in progress. So the headline figures are all very well, but work in progress to establish what the reality is there. What auditing is done by Sports Scotland in terms of selecting groups of people who apply for grants? Do we just take their word for it that they've got X amount of coaches, X amount of volunteers, or do we actually audit some of these organisations, a sample audit? Is there any of that can be shared with us?
Yeah, I mean, every organisation that receives funding, particularly the governing bodies, there is an audit which is usually on a 4-year cycle, but can be whenever we deem that appropriate. I was going to answer earlier on that I think it's important from our perspective, and I think from yours, is the headline figures are fine, but what we are using is the detail that each governing body provides to allow us to examine their capability and capacity to develop that infrastructure. So if more people are going to participate in athletics, we have to know that athletics story. We have to know the swimming story. We have to know the basketball story. So there's a lot of store we put on working with each of those governing bodies in return for the resources that we give them, in some cases very significant, that we see that return. The methodology, we're working with all of them now to try and make sure the returns to us will give us that collective overall picture that you're looking for.
In the past, the money's been handed over, is being spent, and sometimes has been spent. So how have we, we'll discuss the outcomes later because I think that's part of this. So we've handed all over that money. So you have an audit that shows that we have increased activity, increased participation on the say-so of who?
The governing bodies, whoever we're giving money to, will give that back.
So there's no monitoring on that in the governing body?
Of course there is a monitoring of it.
Who does that?
What we do is our own staff will do that. We have a partnership manager that works alongside each of the sports. We have a high performance manager who works alongside. We have a coaching development team who work alongside each of the governing bodies. Ours is not a grant-making process. Ours is, yes, we have a plan we receive from the governing body. We then attach resources to that. We attach ambition and targets to that. And then we have our staff work with those governing bodies to make sure it happens. At the end of each year, we will have a report in all areas of development, performance, capacity building, which will give us a picture of whether that sport has been successful.
How do we know that that is all... Do we just take that at face value?
No, we will audit it directly, but we also engage auditors to do that, to go through their financial accountability, to through their outcomes. So all of that is done, and we can make those available to the committee.
Interesting.
I think, Camilla, it's fair to say that has been a change in relationship over the years between Sports Scotland and the governing bodies, which has been quite difficult to be received by some governing bodies that perhaps have found it difficult to have the kind of level of scrutiny, which, you know, perhaps wasn't the case previously. I think it's the right thing to do, but it has led to tensions, as you can imagine. But I think where public money is involved, it's absolutely right that targets are set, and that if targets are not reached, then questions have to be asked, and that might affect future funding, which has led, as you can imagine, to difficult discussions. But I think it's absolutely the right approach.
When did the scrutiny when did we start applying that scrutiny?
Well, I would say since I became Sports Minister, which was, 2009, that was the kind of beginning of a kind of, well, but just previous to that, there was a beginning of a new, far more robust, I think, relationship between Sports Scotland and the governing bodies, expecting far more kind of drilled down targets, delivery for public money. And all of that now, of course, is very open to public scrutiny because it's all on the web. So every governing body plan and delivery and what they've achieved and what they haven't achieved is all up there for everybody to see. And that brings transparency, but, you know, it's quite difficult for organisations that maybe haven't achieved. But I think that in itself brings pressure to up their game for the next time.
I'll let some others in. I'll come back to cashback later, because that despite strenuous personal efforts to get that level of detail on cashback, for instance, I have been unsuccessful in getting that level of detail. But we can come back to that later. Bob Doris?
Yeah. Thanks, Convener. I thought Convener had some quite interesting questions about how we audit this, and I've got a degree of sympathy for how robust any audit can be in terms of from Sports Scotland to the national governing bodies and the national governing bodies to individual clubs on the ground. And what does an audit mean? Is it a paper exercise, or are you actually physically turning up on the ground and seeing what's going on? There's a balance between a degree of scrutiny and allowing professionally run clubs to get on with the job they're doing. But I want to take it away from the sports organisations on the ground and more thinking about how Sports Scotland and the Scottish Government predict future demand. During the community sport inquiry that the committee did, we obviously saw that depending on the media coverage of tennis or athletics or cycling, you would just get young people just self-presenting to sports centres across the country saying, can I play tennis, can I get on a bike, can I do this, can I do that? Now, of course, I think people were a bit taken aback right across the UK in terms of the sheer level of demand caused by the great success of the Olympic Games, and perhaps a lot of that legacy wasn't built on because there just wasn't the capacity in local communities to make full use of the keenness from people to participate. In terms of the Commonwealth Games, has any modelling work been done, or do you intend to commission any modelling work to work out precisely where people are who would be keen to participate? So when the whole feel-good factor of the Commonwealth Games sweeps over the country, there will be certain sports that will be more likely for young people, and older of course, to want to get involved in sport, and that will create pressure points in leisure facilities right across the country. I'm relaxed about that. That's a good thing. I want these facilities to be put under pressure so we can actually develop and expand sports participation in the country. But we need to know where the pressure will come. There's no point in investing lots of money in one sport and you turn up at a community centre on the Monday morning after the Commonwealth Games and that's not what young people want to do. It's something else they want to do. So, I mean, that's a fairly long way to say, where's the modelling work on this? How do you predicate where that demand's going to be? And then how do you funnel the resources on the ground, whether it's via volunteer capacity, and I suspect a huge amount will need to be volunteer capacity, but can you give me some assurance that that's kind of work in progress and that's something that you're doing?
Well, if I could begin to answer that, and Stewart could come in with some more detail, but we have been working with governing bodies around learning the lessons of the Olympics. So they've been looking through their club infrastructure at what was the bounce, where was it, what did it look like, was it in different sports, in different areas, was there geographical? So that work has been is underway with the governing bodies gathering a lot of that information. Now, you know, can you transport that into Commonwealth Games? I think you can learn lessons, that there will be an uplift, probably across all sports that are featured in the Commonwealth Games. What will be interesting, though, is how that's maintained, or whether it's maintained, because part of the challenge, I think, is that if people come along to a club, try a sport, some people find it's not for them, and it starts to go down again. However, that might not be the case for all sports. So we are looking at the Olympic lessons and how we apply that to the Commonwealth Games. Part of the reason that there's such a focus on club support very directly, and club development and club resourcing and the toolkit, is for clubs to identify themselves, in the light of the lessons learned from the Olympics, what is it they will need to do to make sure that they have the adequate infrastructure within their club to be able to take advantage of an increase in demand. That will be different for different sports in different localities, but the toolkit allows them to look at their club and to look at their resources and what additional resources they have. That then opens the door for a discussion with Sports Scotland about how they can help the club to meet that anticipated demand. So part of it's lessons learned, part of it is trying to apply this toolkit to individual clubs. And so yes, we are doing some modelling around that, because I think, like everybody else, we want to try and maintain that level of interest and avoid a peak and then it falling off the edge of a cliff when people don't want to maintain their interest in the sport. Stewart, I don't know.
Again, the committee will probably remember me talking about the fact that we started capacity building a number of years ago, pre the Olympics and Paralympics, with every community in mind. So our relationship with all 32 geographies through local authorities and their partners is key in all of this. We now have 105 of 159 community sports hubs up and running. The committee reminded us in their recommendations not to forget about clubs that are not part of the community sport hub system. So we have now, with a total of 28 sports, have put a workforce in place of regional development officers, sports specific, whose sole job is to look at capacity building in clubs that are identified locally. That has gone up from we had initially had 5 sports that were covered, we now have 28. So it's a huge increase in a workforce that will be focused solely on 2 things: the development of people and also the development of space plans. You'll probably be aware that swimming has a very good water management plan. We need similar capacity plans around indoor sports and pitches, and we're working with all of our local partners to do that. The demand's there, without a shadow of a doubt, and we've always said that we would use the Olympics, Paralympics and the Commonwealth Games as milestones and motivators to increase that capacity. I think we're well ahead of where we could be.
Can I just ask a very question in relation, because you gave swimming as the example, and that might be a good one because they are a fairly advanced infrastructure. And how is it Swim Scotland, I assume, that
yeah, Scottish Swimming. Yeah.
Scottish Swimming that do that. Okay, so Scottish Swimming have done an audit of all the swimming clubs across the country. They'll know how many sessions of swimming will take place across each local authority area in any given week. Will they also know potentially where the spare capacity is? So are they asking their clubs to consider, well, if a dozen more teenagers were to present to your club the week after the swimming part of the Commonwealth Games finishes, could you cope? What are your contingency plans? How would you develop that? Are those the kind of practical conversations that Scottish Swimming are going through with their clubs? Because those are the kind of practical conversations. Everything else is abstract otherwise. Those are the practical conversations we're hoping every sport via national governing bodies are having, and those are the reassurances, I suppose, that I would be looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. And from that perspective, we've learned a lot from some of the sports that had an infrastructure, had a developed system as such. And again, just to reiterate, we are trying to put a system for sport in place across school, club and performance. So there aren't any gaps. Swimming have done really well. One of the swimming coaches I spoke to the other day talked about, if there's a puddle, we'll use it, because they're so keen to use whatever available capacity there is. And there's a couple of new 50-metre pools. There's obviously a rationalisation of pools, but we're making sure that we use the capacity to its maximum. Every sport, and we've just talked there about 28 sports now have a workforce that will be solely focused on this from a governing body perspective and deployed across regions. And the region brings together the various local authorities and the governing body. It's a really good place for that to meet and develop those plans.
Finally, if each national governing body will be at different levels of preparedness, that's a reality. That's how life works. Where national governing bodies are not quite as advanced as otherwise would be, not asking for you to tell me who those are, would you be calling the heads of those national governing bodies in for some quite frank conversations in order to get them where they have to be?
I think those frank conversations happen on a regular basis. I suppose it goes back to what we were saying earlier on. You know, the Sports Scotland drive quite a hard bargain these days with governing bodies around what's to be delivered. And not least now, because of the focus, particularly those governing bodies that are overseeing Commonwealth Games, sports are under particular pressure. I think where there's a recognition, however, is that, you know, some of the smaller governing bodies of some of the smaller sports, if you like, perhaps don't have the infrastructure and capacity that some of the large governing bodies have, and they've had to have particular support and linking up sometimes with other governing bodies to help with the training and infrastructure that they might not be able to have themselves. So I think that has been recognised. That, but having said that, it's not always, you know, some of the smaller governing bodies, despite that, deliver really, really well. But yeah, you can be reassured that where that's not happening, there's a very robust discussion that takes place.
Have we as a result of all that activity, have we got some numbers on increased participation and increased coaches coming through?
Yes, well, you've produced figures on the coaches that have come through your investment in coaching.
We've had over 14,000 coaches through CPD, 12,000 coaches over the last 3 years have gone through qualifications.
The increase in participation for all the work you're doing and all the money we're putting in, is there a measurement of put that money in, we've got increased participation in numbers, we're reaching kids that would normally participate? Is there information in and around that?
I mean, the household survey, the household survey for the first time last year showed an increase. It's the first time for a long time.
Just a household survey?
Yes.
You've not got any, as part of your monitoring system, you've not...
Well, I'm trying, what we do is we try, and I think the Minister talked about that, we're down almost into the individual sites of community sports hubs, for example. It's a good example. We have 105 up and running. We will monitor every single one of those. As well as with the governing body programmes, Scottish Athletics, for example, have had a 9-month programme. They've increased their coaches and volunteers by 600 and their participants by nearly 2,000. That's quite a significant little case study, and it probably shows the value of looking at each of the sports individually. Yes, we can aggregate it, but it gives us a picture of what the impact is that each of the sports is having on their constituent groups.
I'm just trying to get to what we measure, how we measure success.
Well, if you look
in terms of increased coaches that we're going to need, and participation levels, is it the same kids that we're reaching? Are we involving kids that would be involved anyway, or are we involving those who more likely are not?
Well, the community sports hubs have very much recognised the need to measure that, specifically that it's not just the kids who are involved in every club that are coming to the new clubs, that actually what they're measuring is new participation as well. So these are young people who have never been involved in sport before, to try and make sure we get that information. I think as well, if you look at the direct club investment programme, where money is going directly to clubs, in receipt of that investment, they will be expected to tell Sports Scotland what their growth in participation will be within that club. So yes, if money goes out the door, targets are set, whether that's volunteers, coaches or participation, and that of course would be expected to be delivered for the investment received.
I'm sorry to pain in a bit, but I think the committee were looking for some of this in terms of, but what if the target's set, it's set by the recipient of the funding.
Well, in conjunction, that'll be a discussion between Sports Scotland.
So there's a target set. What if they meet the target? If they don't meet the target, is there consequences of any of this?
Yes. Well, if you look at the governing bodies that haven't met their targets are all there on the web in terms of growth, in terms of volunteers, in terms of coaches, in terms of delivery of elite sport as well. So if they're not meeting their targets that have been set for elite performance, basically their funding is then reviewed.
How many has that happened to?
There's been a significant number. I mean, our board have interviewed, personally, we've asked for presentations from sports that are struggling to meet their targets. They've been able to give some reassurance, but I can reiterate that on an ongoing basis, our staff are working with them to make sure that we get an early warning. This is not about us it's hitting them with a stick. It's trying to work out how they can actually manage to turn around poorer performance.
I know it's the three of you in front of me, because there is I think the committee found that as well. I mean, so whose overall responsibility is it to ensure that we're getting those outcomes? Sports Scotland, local authorities, sport organisations, it's a myriad.
Well, we give Sports Scotland the resources and charge them as our national agency for sport to deliver the world-class system, which is whether that's elite performance or whether it's community participation. And that's therefore what Sports Scotland will do is to have that negotiation with the governing bodies now, in addition to that direct relationship with clubs through the investment programme there. And Sports Scotland will tell us on a regular basis what that delivery looks like and where there are tensions and where there's perhaps underperformance. What I should say as well that is worth mentioning, that on the elite performance, given the we've got a very ambitious target for medal gain for the Commonwealth Games next year, that where sports have not been delivering in terms of their elite performance, some of that's then been taken in-house by the Institute. So there's some very, very direct interventions where governing bodies are not delivering what's required. On occasions that's been taken in-house by the Institute. So I think governing bodies are under no illusion that they're required to deliver, and if they don't deliver, there's certainly consequences.
And where we add value around local government, in particular around active schools, community sport hubs, again we expect targets to be set and for reports to be made from all 32 each year, and we hold those all to account.
Richard Lyle.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Actually, I've got personal experience of, through my son who's involved with a sport, but I'll not name them, that they're being targeted because they're not reaching their targets. So I get the point that Mr Harris was saying. Can I turn to the club self-improvement tool? It's been my experience previously from a local government experience that most clubs don't know where to go, don't know who to apply money for, continually go and maybe speak to one person, and it's trying to grow the club. They have an idea, they have a desire to improve the local, what kids are doing. I know through experience that your regional sports associations, sports clubs, all the things right up to Sports Scotland is working, maybe not as working to the same degree that the convener would suggest that we require, but I know you're miles ahead now of what you were 20 years ago, in fact miles ahead in what you were 5 years ago. So can I turn to the self-improvement tool? And I'll quote, "For many clubs the issue of course is not an unwillingness to grow and develop their capacity, rather it's a lack of awareness of what support is there to assist them as they navigate their way through what can be a cluttered landscape of development and funding advice." I know this is going online, and you're going to basically we'll get 6 priority areas, and they'll get a clear picture. What more are you going to do to involve, to make people know what they can get and what they can't get?
Well, I'll let Stewart deal with some of the detail on that, but the toolkit itself was developed in consultation with governing bodies and clubs themselves to identify where some of the weaknesses were. And you're absolutely right. There is quite a difficult landscape, particularly for smaller clubs. There's a lot of different funding streams. There's a lot of different requirements on clubs. And therefore, this toolkit was developed with them that in a way that would help them to recognise where their gaps were, but more importantly, how they would go about addressing those gaps and those weaknesses, and to help them navigate and find the right fund for them, or find the right support to develop their coaches, to recruit volunteers. So, Stewart, I don't know, do you want to...
There's a key principle here, which is about sustainability. What we've probably had in the past has been a wee bit of a moaning culture, understandably, because people feel they're doing a service in the community and they were feeling frustrated with no help. So what we're saying now is, let's work together in a partnership sense. But the first thing you need to do is understand your own capacity, what resources you have, what your ambitions are. And the staff I talked about, they're tasked with doing that and making sure that there's a sustainable plan for the next 3, 4, 5 years, that club can then, on a progressive basis, try and achieve its ambitions, however modest or how ambitious they would be. I think that's a step change. Our staff, as I said before, are very hands-on. Our partnership manager is very close to either the local authority teams and also the governing bodies at a national level. We facilitate that conversation regionally and lead that conversation, and we try and eradicate as much of the clutter as we possibly can, if I'm using that terminology. So what I'm confident about, and this year we'll see the first tranche of 50 clubs being directly supported, as well as those capacity builders we're putting into governing bodies. I'm really excited about the results we'll see. The deal is, though, in terms of accountability, which has been a theme here, we will have to make those clubs accountable for their own future. If it is to be sustainable, they have to make it work. We can only help, and we'll do everything we can to make that as positive as possible. They have to look at, if a club's going to expand, though, let me just use a difficult one, an indoor sport, say basketball, volleyball, netball, badminton, programming of facilities is still an issue, and we're working with all 32 authorities to deal with that. But for a club to expand, it needs some more space. So we first of all have to secure that, and then secure the staffing to go along with that. That will almost guarantee an increase in participation in that club.
That was actually, through you, convener, that was the next one I want to come on to, was direct club investment programme. I noticed you're allocating £500,000, which could involve something up to £10,000 a club. I'm sure it may not reach 10,000, but up to 10,000. So the jam could be spread more. Rather than 50 clubs, could be 70 clubs. Do you want to give us a wee bit more insight into what you intend to do through this fund?
Hopefully this is just the first of a number. I mean, 50 is a starter for 10. I think by next year, hopefully we'll have a lot more than that. But from our perspective, it gives us an opportunity now to work with each club. We haven't said, this is innovative, I think, we haven't said there's £10,000 available. There'll be a discussion with our staff and local staff about a needs-based analysis based on the tool, which then takes it forward. So if it's a club needs £10,000 to employ a part-time coach, yeah, we'll go there. If they need £6,000 to do something different, then we'll go there as well. As long as the outcomes are agreed and we make sure that's custom-made and tailored to that particular sport and to that particular club.
Last time I was on this committee, just recently returned, we spoke about sports hubs and the fantastic growth that you've had. I'm impressed in the last year. Dave, I know you made a comment that you would like to see a sports hub in every school. Yeah. Do you still stand by that? And I have a particular interest.
We've got to deliver that now.
Well, I have a particular interest in my area. There's one sports hub, but I know, and I've met your regional manager, a lady whose name I can't remember at this moment. But basically, the enthusiasm that she had. Basically, I know there's another programme being worked through in this area for another sports hub. Will there be more money available?
Maybe if I could start to answer that. I think the idea of sports hubs being based around particularly secondary schools is a very good one. Now, it might be, if you look at North Lanarkshire, for example, what they're doing is they're going to make 50% of their secondary schools community sports hubs, but the other 50% will link to a sports hub, which is fine, because it might not make sense if they're 100 yards apart, but what you want is to create a hub, so you want everybody getting access, and the feeder primaries being able to be part of that as well. So I think there's huge ambition there. What we want to do is to begin to look beyond the horizon of where we are at the moment. So the youth sports strategy, which we'll be obviously talking about more in the debate next week, is an opportunity for us to look and engage yourselves, clubs, governing bodies, in a bit of a look over the horizon beyond the target of the 150 community sports hubs to what next. Where should we be going next, and what should our ambitions be? And I think Stewart's ambition for every secondary school to, if not being a sport hub, being linked to a sport hub is a good one, and I think you might be hearing a bit more about that. So.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah.
It's Stu Smith, followed by Annette Miller.
Thank you, Convener. Maybe, I mean, there's a tension in this in asking you to demonstrate in the numbers that we're getting more and more people involved, and of course you're right to say because there's public money involved we need to do that. Is it fair to characterise, though, a situation where we're driving towards bigger clubs rather than more clubs? And what are the tensions involved in doing that? Because particularly from a volunteering perspective, people might be more likely to give their time volunteering in a club where they feel that their volunteering makes a bigger difference, and that might be a smaller group of people and a more community focused than in a larger setting where they feel, well, if I don't go there, then it's okay because there's somebody else who's going to pick it up. So how are you managing that tension?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. One of the discussions with governing bodies, particularly around those sports that are perhaps less developed, is actually sometimes about the growth in clubs. So in areas where there aren't many clubs within a particular sport, part of the discussion will be, well, how do you actually grow and develop more clubs, particularly in areas where there's a demand but they're not being met. So I suppose it's going to be a mixture. Some of it, yes, will inevitably be a growth in some very successful clubs that are going to take advantage of what's available. They're able to expand. I can think of some in my own patch where they're already in discussions about maybe taking on new premises and so on. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's to be encouraged. But I think we also have to make sure that where there is a dearth of clubs in a particular sport in an area, that the focus is perhaps on developing embryonic clubs for the first time and supporting them and getting people, which is quite difficult because it's a real challenge for those individuals involved if it's a kind of new territory. Trying to get a club established from scratch is not without its challenges, but I think that's the balance that really needs to be struck.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to identify the tension. Community sports hubs, whilst there's been some new pieces of those community sports hubs generated, new sports, new activities, that has brought smaller entities together. And I think, back to the words I was talking about earlier, the aim is sustainable participation. That's at the heart of everything we do. But it's a mixed economy out there, because I think if we're going to look at growth, community sports hubs is one way of doing that. If we're looking at raising standards and building some capacity in some of the bigger clubs we have, we'll do that as well, and that's through the workforce that we're putting in place to make sure that we take a customised approach depending on what it is we're trying to achieve. So bringing smaller units together to make them more sustainable, absolutely, but also developing the capacity of the bigger, more ambitious clubs, that's going to work as well.
And I think the Minister mentions there, identifying the gap and then trying to respond to it. And I think that goes to the heart, for me, of the convener's questions, and I think what the committee's report was concerned with around gaps. That what I'm looking for, I suppose, is that where we're using statistics to try and understand what is going on, where are the examples of how we have then responded and changed because of a trend that is identified or a gap that is identified, because otherwise we're just looking at statistics saying there are lots of people in Scotland who are engaged and active in sport, and that's fantastic and we applaud it. But if those are not in, it's quite a simple test for me in terms of the Commonwealth Games, because I don't want to be in a situation after 2014 where people in my city say the Commonwealth Games is something that happened, rather than something they were part of, and it's something that they immediately after an event or at the time that events were going on were able to say, right, well, my kids were in their park and able to take up that sport that they hadn't been able to do before. And unless you have a planned out programme, it seems to me at this stage, that identifies in volunteering, we simply don't have the number of people to coach that particular sport, how do we then respond to it? So where are the examples of where you've either geographically been able to say that is the problem and we're actually going to, what we were doing was good, but we're going to change it because we've identified this as being a bigger priority, and at what stage will we start to see those?
I think the initiatives that we talked about that are new around the specific support for clubs to identify their needs and be able to respond is exactly in response to that, because it was identified that actually we couldn't just wait for clubs to maybe respond in a way that was going to achieve what was needed to meet the capacity. We had to give them a way of doing that and incentives to do that and a bit of a push to do that. So the toolkit that Stewart was describing earlier is their way of doing it. The funding then is the incentive, because if they do it and identify gaps, there's then resources to help them meet those gaps, and the direct investment in clubs is again another incentive for clubs that have identified that they are going to see a growth, and of course many will, that they're able to put all those mechanisms in place. If you look at some good examples like Glasgow Life, for example, they've already seen, because of all the attention within Glasgow to the Commonwealth Games, you would expect that they would be seeing a particular uplift, and they have. And a lot of work has gone on within Glasgow Life to make sure that the capacity is there. What we're making sure is that similar discussion and preparation is happening in the other 31 local authorities that are maybe not quite as hands-on with the Commonwealth Games, but nevertheless they're going to see an increase. So all of that is a structured way of not leaving it to chance and making sure that the right conversations are happening, the right strategies are being put in place, the right action plans, the right resources, the clubs with the capacity to grow are being supported. But where, for example, there's minor sports that are going to be showcased, where there is inevitably going to be a big interest, but there's maybe not much of a club structure at the moment, focus is being put there to help new clubs to develop, because if a kid wants to play a sport that they've suddenly just seen showcased and there's no club, then that's going to obviously be very frustrating for the young person concerned. So it's trying to identify all of those gaps and meet them. It's a big task, but we had a lot of work's been going on in it for quite some time. Local authorities are obviously very key in this, and I think it's fair to say, Stewart, you've been working very closely with them in terms of trying to meet these gaps.
The conversation you're talking about in particular, and this was a gap, but when we put together a regional working practice, it's not an entity as such. This is where we bring together governing bodies of sport and the various local authorities. So if I just use the East, for example, as a case in point, where you've got Scottish Borders, the Lothians, Edinburgh, sitting around the table talking about with Sports Scotland, about the gaps, about modelling, about capacity, about workforce, and making decisions which they would then recommend to us about priorities. That's where the conversation happened. It's the only place in which we can make that. It's not effective or efficient to do it 32 times. So we've tried to bring that together regionally and make that conversation bite. The decisions weren't all universally popular. I think some of the sports would want everything tomorrow, but we've had to take a very pragmatic approach based on what people are saying is possible to achieve. So this is what we think we can actually do, given some help. Then we've gone with that. As we learn lessons, we'll put more and more of that resource in place, particularly directly into the clubs, because that sustainability of communities, I think, is key in all of this. Reassure the committee again, in every site that we work with, whether it be a direct club investment, or whether it be a community sport hub, we will expect a report back about participation, about volunteers, about workforce on an annual basis, and we'll aggregate those figures.
There's also I should just say that, remember the set of databases that have been established for legacy monitoring. Donnie, I don't know if you might want to say a bit more about that, but there was a set of databases as a kind of baseline to be able to measure some of this across, across the whole of Scotland. So that's been put in place, and a lot of statistical work has been taken forward by the legacy team, so that we can try to pull all of this into one place to be able to tell the story in not just the narrative but the hard figures behind the story of what we started off with and what we'll end up with post games. And I think that's really important, because I think folk want to know, and quite rightly want to know, what has been the impact, what has been the... So we've got that baseline, and post games we'll be able to see and measure kind of where we've got to from there to there through all of the databases, using all of these stats and figures, whether it's the community sports hubs, whether it's the participation numbers through the governing bodies, whether it's the survey. Donnie, I don't know if you want...
Yeah, just to say briefly, we can send the committee details of what is a fairly comprehensive legacy and monitoring and evaluation programme. We recently presented to something called the COCOM, which is the Commonwealth Commission, which oversees delivery of the games. And they were really impressed by the robustness of our evaluation programme, so we're happy to send those details to the committee.
I think just in terms of, if I can, I mean, I agree. We want to tell a story, and I said, you know, what failure would look like to me in Glasgow, but you know, we want to think about it in terms of what success looks like. And I think there's an advantage of telling the story, because either we want to be in a position of saying, well, massive public expenditure went into a lot of this, and we want to know whether we delivered on it, and that's very key. But also there's a huge opportunity here, and how do we then do better in the future? So what is the next thing we do? And if we're in a position, in, you know, at the end of 2014 to be able to say, here is what we set out to do, here is the difference we made, we either got really close to what we hoped we'd get, or we got just over what we hoped we'd get, we can then be more ambitious next time around. So just specifically on volunteering, what is the... You know, you talked about there's when money goes out the door, there's a target associated with that money. What does that then add up to, either regionally or ideally at the national level, where, you know, yes, there are always going to be gaps in particular sports in particular areas where, you know, swimming might not be the thing in a particular area because there's a facility issue or whatever. But at the national level, do we know we will have X number of more volunteers in Scotland participating regularly in sporting activities for our children, and if we don't, then something went wrong?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things to note about that in terms of something we've learned from the Olympics that was a bit of a missed opportunity, I think, was the whole ethos of volunteering around the Olympics was huge, and yet most of the people who volunteered in and around the Olympics, there's no measurement to see whether any of them actually continued to volunteer, and I thought that was a missed opportunity. So what we did was, when people registered to be a volunteer, they were asked for permission for their data to be shared post-games with other volunteering bodies. So through Volunteer Development Scotland, there are opportunities for them to become volunteers, not just in major events, but potentially locally in their own area, in clubs. Now, we will obviously want to see the success of that, and it won't just be a case of, well, if they you know, there'll be a lot of promotion and proactive work with those volunteers to encourage them to be so. And I think what our expectation would be is that we'll see some good results from that, because people will have been enthused, perhaps volunteering for the first time, and will want to do more of that. But if you don't seize the moment post-Commonwealth Games, then that enthusiasm will inevitably wane. So we've done that very much with the intention of gathering that. The only other thing I would say, and again this was a lesson learned from the Olympics, is that while the focus will quite rightly be on the fantastic job the volunteers will do around the Commonwealth Games and harnessing that resource post-Games, we shouldn't forget all the other volunteers who volunteer day in, day out in their local clubs, and we're looking to find ways of recognising that, because I think there was a wee bit of feeling that all the focus was on folk who were volunteering for a short period of time, whereas there wasn't maybe the same focus on the volunteer workforce who have been given their time for years. And I think we need to do that as well. And that way we can also highlight some of the great volunteering opportunities within the local community. Now, all of that, I believe, and I'm really very confident, will add up to an uplift in volunteering effort. Hard to put a figure on it though, but you know, we are confident that there will be an uplift. It's sustaining that uplift though and keeping people involved, and that's why we've gone about it in the way we have, having learnt lessons from elsewhere.
I mean, it's just the test. I think it has to be that we're doing more than simply doing more measurement, and therefore we get an uplift because we count more people.
Well, the test will be what that delivers. I mean, with the work going on, expansion of clubs, development of new clubs, really what it boils down to, we want more people participating. I mean, that's the win, that's the success, that's what I'll be happy with as the Minister for the Commonwealth Games and Sport, is that we see more people participating in sport and activity. And the volunteers, though, are such a crucial part of that, because without the volunteers and the volunteered coaches, none of that would be possible. So they're such an important part of it that it couldn't happen without them. But if you're asking me for what does success look like, it looks like more people participating on a regular basis in sport and physical activity. That's what it boils down to.
And just from that perspective, wherever we've invested money, we've tried to understand what the position has been prior to the investment of money. And hopefully by even the time before the games begin, we should have a story to tell which says, here's the capacity we've been able to build through investment, through the investment of resource and effort from agencies such as Sports Scotland and partners, but also the local people and local communities, if this is going to be sustainable. So we should be able to say, in the athletics example I gave earlier on, for over a 9-month period, for a small amount of resource, part-time positions in and around clubs, the growth of almost 600 coaches and volunteers in those athletics communities is quite phenomenal. But it's a result of investment in the right place and people being focused on achieving those outcomes. You're absolutely right to draw that to attention, because I think sport in the distant past has not been great at that, but now we're much more making anyone who gets investment accountable to report what they have done with the resource and what the difference is it's made to that club or community.
To Mr. Jack, and the baseline. Is the baseline 195,000 people actively? Is that the baseline actively? Yes. Volunteer? That's it. That's a baseline now. The 13,000 clubs, the 90,000. It's growing on those numbers.
Yes, I think that is right.
We all agreed on that.
Yeah.
Well, the club figure, 13,000 is a lot of clubs, and if again, it'll depend on how it's counted, but if we there's one community sport hub that I'm aware of has nearly 30 smaller clubs now part of this bigger entity, which makes it much more sustainable. Bigger clubs, it's all about the capacity. So from our perspective, these numbers are a moment in time. We will balance, I think, the bigger figures, the national figures, with very clear progress reports on individual sites. I think that will help give a picture across the country.
Hesitate. I mean, I suppose that's what we're trying to pinpoint. What is the baseline? If we're being presented with figures now, 4.5% of the population, is that the baseline? The 195,000, is that the baseline? Number of clubs, is that the baseline? So we'd be looking for growth in all of these areas.
Yes, I mean, I'm not hesitating, Convener. You're absolutely right. We do need a baseline against which we can measure success. And as far as I'm concerned, it would be the 195,000 figure. The question about numbers of clubs is more problematic, because clubs form and then dissolve on a continuing basis depending on the uptake of their activities. So I wouldn't set much store in saying by X we will have 15,000 clubs, for example. But in terms of the volunteering workforce, we would absolutely use the 195,000 figure. Yeah. We would include the wider family in those numbers, not actively participating, because the 195 figure is people actively volunteering in sport. Yes. I think it's
so with that, we would start counting the families, which would boost that number probably.
I think the secret...
Do that paper exercise and that tomorrow probably.
I think the way to do this, Convener, is to, as Stewart and the Minister has alluded to, is to get more robust data on which we will build that baseline, because at the moment it's not there.
See the baseline.
Yeah.
When are those figures going to be available?
Well, the legacy baseline information is already there. I remember it was Richard Simpson actually pursued us very heavily on this previously to make sure that we were able to have that baseline measurements, but there's a number of them. They cut across a number of areas. And probably the best thing would be for us to send that to you. We did have there is, all that information is available on the website, but I think it would probably be helpful if we put it into a format for you and sent it on.
Before it gets lost, the 150 sports hubs that was mentioned earlier, does that equate to an increase from the 14 local authority sports strategies that we took evidence on? Does that mean the 150 sports hub mean that we've got 32 sports strategies in place now across Scotland, or do they not link? Do they not equate to one another?
Well, there should be reference within those sports strategies to the community sports hub development. So each sports strategy within the 32 local authorities, which I think there's we're almost there. Yeah. There was maybe one or two that haven't quite got there yet.
The 14 that was reported at the committee. They would refer not just to community sports hubs, but really how they're going to use their asset base, how they're going to use their facilities, what new facilities do they need, how they're going to better utilise what they've got, as well as their ambitions for community sports hubs within their local area. So they've made some progress there, with some information on that.
Yeah,
would be useful.
There's been some additional work done, Renfrewshire, Inverclyde, Shetland, and we've been helping them very much hands-on deliver their strategies.
Progress are nailed down, or
they're at different stages, but we'd like to think it's an ambition of ours to get them all nailed down.
Good. Yeah, thanks. Annette.
I'm interested in what you say in your letter about working with the NUS to try and involve more students in volunteering, and I just wonder, can you elaborate on that?
Yes. Well, actually, it was NUS themselves approached us with a desire to look at what they could do, having, I suppose, again, learnt a few lessons from the Olympics. There was a campaign around the Olympics to get students involved, whether as volunteers, but also things happening on campuses around the Olympics and getting people more interested in participation in sport. So we have met with NUS and we've agreed that what we should do is to have do some work with them that is very much focused on encouraging campuses to do a number of things, host events, have events, get students more involved in sport, to link perhaps with higher education institutes in other Commonwealth countries. I should say the same goes for colleges as well. It's not just about universities, but colleges as well. But also to look at how we can encourage students to volunteer on a more regular basis. There are a lot of students volunteering at the moment. A lot of students who are on sports courses, for example, do a lot of work with local clubs, and that works really, really well. However, there's a whole wide audience of students who are not on sports courses who could also become involved in supporting volunteering in sport, or indeed in other walks of life as well. So that was the essence of the conversation, and there's now work going on to look at how do we do that, how is that best supported, how can we get a lot of enthusiasm going on within colleges and universities around the Commonwealth Games, and hopefully that will lead to with the outcome being for a sustainable uplift in student volunteering at the end of.
I mean, that's probably a good thing for the future. I mean, I don't know if there's a possibility of them working locally with perhaps school-age people as well in volunteering. And I can see then, once they move on from university, college life into whatever they're going to do afterwards, if that culture is embedded in them, it hopefully will carry on into their further life.
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, that already happens, particularly those who are on the sport courses. They already are, a huge resource for working within schools and local clubs. But I think there's more that can be done. Stewart, I don't know if you want to say a wee bit about the SUS.
Yeah, we've done quite a bit of work around Scottish university sport. We support them financially. We've got good relationships with all of the universities and most of the colleges, although that landscape's changing a little bit. But you mentioned a point about secondary school and older students, and that I think there's been an enormous amount done there, both in school around young sports leaders, which has been done as part of the education system, which I'm very appreciative of, because that's a really good thing to do. We've expanded the young ambassadors from 64 to 672, 2 in every secondary school, and their job is to work with their peers, to enthuse them about, yes, participating, but also giving something back to their school, their community. We're so proud of those young people, and that jump, it's a big jump from 64 to 672. Again, we manage and support that network by helping to train them and give them information. And having spent a bit of time in Fife just listening to young people who said to me, we would never have been able to stand up and talk in public to an audience like this without having had that experience. It's really quite, it certainly enthuses me that we're seeing the results of that, and hopefully we'll see a lot more of it.
Yeah.
Quite exciting. Thank you.
Any other questions? Eileen?
Thanks very much, Convener. Just related to pick up a comment from my colleague Annette. One of the things that we haven't really kind of mentioned so far is about the skills legacy of the games, and obviously in terms of the lessons that we can learn from the games, in terms of how our volunteers being able to use the experience that they gain from the games, as a kind of pathway to future training, learning, and employment. And I know in the letter that you supplied to the committee, Minister, you mentioned the Legacy 2014 Scotland's Best Employability Programme, as well as the Games volunteer qualifications. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about some of those initiatives.
Yes, happy to do so. I think we felt very strongly that there was an opportunity to create opportunities for a number of people who might otherwise not be touched by the Commonwealth Games. So if you take young people, for example, a lot of young people have come forward to volunteer, and hopefully a lot of them will be successful. However, and I know that the committee were quite interested in this, what about young people who might have not put themselves forward for whatever reason, lack of confidence, don't see themselves in that role? And Scotland's Best is really an attempt to do something about that. So 1,000 young people aged 16 to 19 will be able to get the experience through the Commonwealth Games and other major events to get accredited training through volunteering opportunities. And of course, a lot of the work that will be done with those young people will be around confidence and confidence building and developing their skills. Now, I think that's really, really important, because I think part of the success, and going back to Drew Smith's point about how do we measure success, and yes, I suppose the big one is participation, but for me it's also about life-changing experiences for folk who otherwise would not have had that life-changing experience, but you've got to help create those. They're not necessarily going to happen of their own accord. So for young people who are furthest away from the labour market, shall we say, Scotland's Best, I think, provides a good opportunity. Now, there are other programmes in Glasgow, particularly, that's a good fit with, and hopefully through all those programmes we'll be able to reach young people who are going to get a really good opportunity in life. The Games volunteer qualification as well is an opportunity for those who are successful and get to be one of the 15,000 Games volunteers to be able to take something away from that. So a personalised SQA supported certificate will capture the skills that they've gained through the Games, and that's something they'll be able to take with them either to enhance their employment prospects or to further education or whatever they choose to do with it. But we felt really strongly that people should get something that can, again, potentially open new doors for them, having had the chance to be a volunteer.
In terms of the Scotland's Best Employability Programme, how's that been advertised?
Well, it was launched by First Minister a couple of weeks ago, wasn't it? And what were I think the contract's been awarded now. I think it has. So basically what we'll be doing is, or they will be doing, is working with our partners across 32 local authorities to identify through those partnerships young people who will benefit from that programme. So they'll be working with the agencies who are on the ground within those communities to identify young people who this would be a really good opportunity for.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Gil Patterson.
Thank you very much, Convener. I wanted to sort of ask questions in regards to workforce volunteering, and I know the government itself, within its area of influence, is encouraging its own workforce to participate in volunteering. And I also know that local authorities are encouraging their workforce to do likewise. So looks like the public sector are doing their very best to engage in that area. I wonder what steps the government's taking to tap into the resource that the private sector have, and encourage them to participate in volunteering.
Yeah, I think it's really important, although with the current financial climate and economic backdrop, it's quite a tough ask. It's a tough ask of the public sector as well as the private sector, because you know, it's not cost free, because people who are volunteering, obviously that has to be covered. However, I think it's a really, really important thing to do, and that's why we have introduced a commitment for 5 days paid leave for volunteering options around the Commonwealth Games, in a way of, I suppose, showing a bit of leadership around that, hoping others will follow suit. There are some really good examples within the private sector, whether that's like, you know, BT or John Lewis and so on, that have ongoing volunteering opportunities and indeed mentoring. You know, there's some really good programmes where there's a joining up between those in business with expertise, those running clubs, to transfer some of that experience and skill base. I know that the SSA were very keen to do more around volunteering across all the sectors, and we are in discussion with them at the moment about how that's best to be achieved. But it is something that we do want to see, not just for the games, but beyond the games as well. I think also there's, you know, employers, perhaps there's more work to be done to show employers a bit more about the benefits of their staff volunteering, because it's not just that those individual employees get a benefit, but the organisation gets a benefit, because those employees are bringing back a lot of a good ethos, if you like, but also a lot of skills themselves that they've gathered out volunteering in the community, particularly in sport. So it is a win for the organisation as well. So there are a lot of good examples, but there's more to be done, and the SSA, we're working with them to look at how that can be taken forward.
I think one of the areas that private companies and the private sector itself respond to and are very, very used to is recognition. They, you know, within the workforce, you know, there's schemes, an everyday occurrence in business is recognition and awards and things such as that. You know, they don't cost an arm and a leg. They tend to be very, very cheap. And I wondered if you would consider that if awards for volunteers in general, across the sectors and across the size of the organisations, a tiny participating sport in itself might have a heading. But I wondered if you would consider that, you know, an award for maybe the public sector or a particular sport, but maybe it might be something that would encourage business. And I take the point that you make, things are tight, but nevertheless, there's money available, and companies do advertise. They advertise in different ways. Sometimes they advertise by clipping themselves onto causes. So I wondered if you could consider that. It might seem that I'm offensive that the business should get something out of, you know, volunteering, but that's the reality. And I wonder if it's something you would consider.
Well, certainly something I'm happy to consider. We are looking at the moment of ways of highlighting the work that volunteers in sport, how that's recognised more fully, and we're looking at plans at the moment of how to do that. So we could include having a look at that within that work. So happy to take that forward.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? I've just got some of that in the cash back in terms of the governance again. I think it was highlighted in a report about you know, the lack of information about where the money was spent. I think you identified in your response, Minister, that some £24 million is going into providing young people facilities and positive opportunities there. It's not publicly available and hasn't been publicly available about the type of issues that we were speaking about earlier in terms of where the money's going, whether participation rates are improving, whether we're getting long-term benefit out of that, and indeed some witnesses raised the issue of it being less than strategic, obviously because they have found out in athletics and racquetball and squash that the money has run out. You know, so maybe understandable there. That, but I think there are genuine issues here about transparency, about a significant amount of money and how many young people that it is actually benefiting. And I don't know where you can help on that.
Well, you'll be aware that there is an evaluation plan that's been ongoing, and that we did check this before coming today in terms of the time frame, and we understand that plan is going to be published shortly. I know that Kenny McCaskill wrote to the committee to confirm that in his letter. And we've checked that, and our understanding is that the evaluation plan will be published shortly, and that should contain some of the information that you're looking for.
Yes. Given that £24 million of
Sure.
that goes into your remit, and with the arm of Sports Scotland and others with the capability of actually looking at this overall and strategically, where has it went? How many people have participated? Because there are all sorts of claims from, you know, 600,000 young people, I presume is the £50 million pot. I think you yourself said there was 100,000 young people benefited in a sporting relationship. How do we know that is the case?
Well, what I can say is that the cashback programmes are very heavily monitored in terms of participation, and that is all recorded, and that will form part of the evaluation information that's due out shortly. What I can say more generally about cashback and its relationship to other funds and the way that where it sits is that we have taken a more strategic approach over the last 2-3 years to not have funds working in isolation to one another. So Stewart Harris and his team have pulled together all of the funders who sit around the table, including cashback, to look at how things are funded and what the best way is to fund what and why. So instead of say a project that is looking for funding for a particular purpose, instead of them possibly going around 10 different funding organisations looking for the fund, if it's deemed that this is actually something that is worthwhile by the funders collectively, there's then a more strategic approach to look at, well, what's the best fund for to fund that project, and to do that on a more strategic basis, and also to identify where there are gaps and what the strategic approach is to funding projects. What is it we want to achieve? What are the priorities? Because you can't fund everything, and neither would we want to fund everything and spread the jam so thinly. So it is about what are the things that we want to fund, what are the priorities, and how do we deploy the different funds, whether it's lottery money, whether it's mainstream funds through Sports Scotland, whether it's some of the third sector organisations that have resources, or whether it's cash back. And that's been in operation now for about a year and a half.
Yeah, significant time. I mean, in a capital sense, any cashback money that comes to us for pitches, particularly 3G pitches, our needs analysis will tell us where the likely gaps are and where those pitches could go. 3G pitches have a capacity which is way beyond grass, and this has allowed us to accelerate our strategic ambitions locally. You made a comment about one or two sports saying this is not strategic. Well, our expectation is they need to be strategic with any resource they get. So it's whether it's our money, whether it's government money, lottery money, cashback, they need to, and we expect them to look at the resources available and be very clear about what's possible and not go down a track of things that are not sustainable. And I think that's important. There's always been that hint sometimes to sports that the money is available for 2 years. That's a big hint. So make sure you plan properly and don't get caught out making claims that you can support things for long enough.
Because, of course, the ethos as we understood it was to reach those communities where there was deprivation, criminality, whatever. So I don't know how it fits into that overall strategic of slicing up the pot. And we know that in evidence that you previously given lauding football in schools, Minister, where they were doing such a good job involving young people in football to divert them from bad behaviour. We had a subsequent report from that wasn't reaching those young people. You know, so it's about being responsive, I think. And my big issue here, as an MSP, and indeed interested in this as a convener, is that there is a complete lack of transparency in this. I can't FOI any of this information in terms of they're not covered under the Act. They've been advised by Scottish Government officials that shouldn't do that. They're working on something else. I've had, you know, from participants, people saying to me, I'm very surprised, I'm happy to share this information, it's dated now, but here have it. Others refusing to give me that information. So I welcome and I hope that it provides the detail that we're looking for down to those levels about participation rates and outcomes, which defeated me for over a year trying to get that information. Yeah. Mr. Jack.
Yes, Convener, I understand, and indeed when I last appeared before the committee I mentioned the Cashback Strategic Delivery Group and the work of Inspiring Scotland. Mr McCaskill referred to that in his letter, and the Inspiring Scotland work is a longitudinal study, so it started and it will continue, but during that process there will be regular reports, and I think the starting point for that will be the publication of the evaluation plan and then subsequent reporting on that after that happens. But you're absolutely right. We need to have an understanding of what is being delivered through cashback. And so Inspiring Scotland are not just looking at projects which are currently underway, but they're doing a retrospective analysis of where investment is going and what the outcomes have been delivered on that. Because as a member of the Strategic Delivery Group, our view is that we need to have that broader understanding before we make future decisions or future recommendations to ministers as to which projects we should actually be supporting. And I could tell the committee we're being far more forensic in our assessment and our analysis of individual projects which are coming towards us and being quite challenging in some of these. That previously there has been a history whereby projects which were funded historically have come back and automatically thought that they will be funded again. That's not now the case. We're going through business cases in a fine-tooth comb, challenging people, getting them in to present to us as to why we should invest taxpayers' money in this specific project.
Spent £50 million and it's been allocated.
Yeah.
I suppose that's the problem.
Well, but the retrospective look that
yes.
Donnie Jack spoke about, we'll look into that.
But why now, Minister, rather than why weren't we doing it already?
Well, I think there was certainly always data gathered around, you know, who's participating in the cashback programmes. I think, though, this is a kind of much deeper look at what that has delivered in order, not least, as Donnie Jack just said, to inform future investment decisions. One of the challenges, though, with cashback monies that I think we all appreciate is that because it's intermittent, you don't know how much cashback is coming from one year to the next because it depends obviously on proceeds of crime. It's a difficult resource to apply to revenue funding because you just don't know how much is coming in the following years. So it does tend to lend itself better to capital expenditure. So therefore, what we need to make sure is that where that capital spend happens, that we're able to gather information about who benefits from that and what it delivers. I mean, the programmes that you mentioned around the schools of football and schools of rugby, I take your point and what you're saying. However, I've also met some of those young people, and I think it's fair to say that their attendance at school perhaps wouldn't be what it is if it wasn't for the fact that they're involved in some of those schools, because some of the young people, for a variety of reasons, were at risk of not being within the school environment. So, you know, but all of that has to be, you're right, and it's important we're able to demonstrate, you know, some of that. So the evaluation plan will hopefully give you what you're looking for, and it will certainly help us in making sure that we're deploying cash back in the right way compared to some of the other funds, because it might be that actually there are other funds that could fund some of aspects of these, and cash back could be used for other uses. So it's about getting the right money into the right place.
No, true.
If I can, convener, I mean, I'm sure the Minister will appreciate people's interest in it. I mean, we all want to, and I'm sure it'll be the case in your own area, I've no doubt that it is, that, you know, it is a complicated issue about where this money originates from, and there are complications around that, and of course it's then complicated about the benefit you get when you spend money in this sort of way. But as an overall principle, it should be cash back and not cash diverted. And so that, you know, that we need to get a lot more detail to understand that we are not creating a situation where we're creating a redistributive redistribution, a regressive redistribution of cash that comes from communities facing the biggest challenges and ends up going to people who are the most eager and find it easiest to fill in an application form at any given time for a project that suits them. How do we get round that? And I mean, to the extent of, should we actually be operating this as a grant, you know, as a grant process in that way at all, that we give the money out, you know, in year, rather than saying, well, would we not be better establishing a longer term fund? And
I think that's the point that Donnie Jack was making, that the strategic group is looking at that very issue about how do we deploy cash back, and how does it cash back sit with all the other resources that we have to deploy it in a more strategic way. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I suppose you could argue that you know, that a lot. I mean, if you were to take the funding of a pitch, for example, it's not just about the pitch being located in a community that suffers from crime, but it's then about who uses the pitch, and how do we make sure that the young people who benefit from it are those maybe least likely to turn up without encouragement. I have to say, in my own patch, I've seen some great work going on where the cashback funded projects very much linked into the kind of youth work infrastructure in the area. So there's young people coming to football sessions that, quite frankly, if they weren't there, they would be hanging about the street, and were hanging about the streets. Some of them involved in criminal activity, and actually there's been quite a sizable impact there with those young people, and they've benefited hugely personally from that. So I think for me that's cashback working, doing what it set out to do, but hopefully you'll see from the evaluation more detail around that and where the balance lies. But it is a really good resource, but it's a resource that isn't without its difficulties in making sure that you're not creating a reliance upon cashback that can't be sustained. And I think we've learnt some lessons around that from some of the funding decisions, for the best of reasons, but that then created a dependency on those resources that just can't be sustained. So we've got to be very careful about how we deploy cashback, but the group that Donnie is involved in, it was absolutely set up with that purpose going forward. But I think it's also, we do recognise that retrospectively there is a need to to give the information about what's been spent where, and the evaluation
look at participation rates and areas, and carry out all that evaluation, will it?
Well, the
retrospectively?
My understanding is that it will do that, convener, but I'll double check that.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. But I thank you. Oh, yes, sorry, Stewart.
It's probably just important, just the point you made there about applications. We have a very, doesn't matter where the money comes from, we we have a strategic approach, particularly to the capital side. So our conversations we're having regularly with all 32 areas, through the local authorities mainly, but also dropping down into communities, is about need and where the priorities should be with each of those. So it's not as just a free-for-all, it's very strategic, or much more strategic certainly than it was before. Happy again to talk to you about how that happens in any of the authorities, just to case study it if you want.
Thank you, Minister, and your colleagues for being with us this morning. Thank you for the evidence provided. Thank you very much. Suspend it at this point until we turn round the panel. To item number 3 on the agenda, looking at the Scottish strategy for autism. And I welcome our second panel this morning, Michael Matheson, Minister for Health. Welcome, Minister. Jean Maclellan, Deputy Director, Adult Care and Support Division. And Annette, Pyle, Policy Manager, Care and Support, Adult Care and Support Division, Scottish Government. Welcome to you all. And I invite the Minister to make an opening statement before we proceed to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for your opportunity to attend today's committee meeting. The autism strategy was launched just over a year and a half ago and aims to ensure that people with autism and their families are supported by the widest possible range of services, including social care, education, housing and employment. We're beginning to make a real difference to the lives of people with autism by improving support services available to people who need them. We're making good progress, but this is early stages in the development of the strategy's work, and there is still much more to be done. Alongside the strategy, I announced an investment of £13.4 million of funding over 4 years to build on improvements to autism services and access to these services. As part of this funding, an Autism Development Fund was made available to local and national organisations to deliver local services on the ground. 23 organisations across Scotland received funding from the first round of this fund. After the high level of interest from local and national organisations in submitting bids for the fund, I decided to increase the level of funding to £1.5 million, as the original £1 million did not meet demand from the large number of local and national organisations who submitted bids. The second round of funding has enabled a further 30 organisations to deliver local projects throughout Scotland. These projects are tackling local needs for people with autism throughout Scotland. Funding is also being delivered for the rollout of 6 new one-stop shops, in addition to the 2 already in Glasgow and Edinburgh. The Fife and Lanarkshire and Highland one-stop shops have already opened, and 2 additional one-stop shops are planned in Grampian and Ayrshire and will open soon. And the one-stop shop in Perth is being launched today. These are voluntary sector models working in partnership with local authorities, the NHS and local groups representing parents and those with ASD, and each one will be tailored to meet the needs of individuals. I have been out to see these services myself, and I can see the real difference that they are beginning to make for individuals. Given that the Scottish Government's joint partnership with COSLA in delivering this strategy, we provided £1.12 million to local authorities to allow them to develop local autism strategies and the associated action plans. We've also made funding available to the Open University and the University of Strathclyde to enable professionals working in all aspects of autism services and carers of people on the spectrum to study by distance learning and other methods of delivery-specific autism courses. This initiative will enable about 1,000 people to study an understanding of autism courses free of charge over a 3-year period. This will help to ensure that people on the spectrum will have access to professionals within autism services which understand the specific needs of people on the spectrum. Other projects which have been funded include the Scottish Autism to analyse and apply NAPS research, which investigates which early interventions work for people with autism and their cost effectiveness within the Scottish context, a waiting list project to develop adult diagnostic service solutions and to drive down waiting times, the revision of the Autism Toolbox, which is a practical resource in classrooms to help ensure successful inclusion of children with autism and is available in schools across Scotland. The new toolbox will be web-based and be much more accessible. These initiatives will make a real impact in delivering on the recommendations of the strategy. It will help local authorities to develop strategies and action plans and will help organisations deliver services locally where people need them to help to improve issues around waiting times and to improve interventions and to share best practice. All this autism work is being undertaken and will help to realise our vision as part of the strategy. Since the launch of the strategy, much work has been undertaken to improve services for people with autism, their families and carers. But this is a 10-year strategy and more needs to be done. It's important that the work on autism continues to grow and to develop in Scotland to deliver the improved access, to improve services and to enrich the lives of people with autism and their families in Scotland.
Thank you, Minister, for those opening remarks. And the first questions from Bob Doris.
Thank you very much, Convener. One of the things I noticed was reading through my briefing for this morning's evidence session was that we should be drawing towards the end of an initial mapping exercise across Scotland's 32 local authorities to actually quantify accurately for the first time all the various services and supports that are out there in terms of those that are involved in supporting people and families living with autism. Now, I see that's due to be completed by June 2013. I also note that the one-stop shops in Glasgow and Edinburgh are now up and running, and they're hopefully improving the service for people with autism in Glasgow, the area that I represent, and in the city of Edinburgh. Can we assume then that the mapping exercise is complete in Glasgow and Edinburgh? How close are we to completing that mapping exercise across the country? And I suppose, how will you then use any analysed results of that mapping exercise to direct funding to fill in where the gaps in provision are?
An important part of taking forward the strategy was to make sure that the resource we were providing was being targeted at the areas that would have the biggest impact, and also would help to address areas where there were gaps in services. And that's why some of the funding as part of the strategy was targeted at mapping what actually was available within local authority and health board areas. So we provided resource to a number of the national autism organisations to engage mappers who had the responsibility of not just looking at what local authorities and health boards were providing, but also engaging with parents and with those who have autism on what their views are of the services that are available and where the gaps are as well. That work has been more or less completed. I'm waiting for the report to be submitted. I've been advised that the report will be submitted to us by the end of this month. And once we have that report, we'll be able to make a decision on what we want to then take forward in terms of what our response is going to be and how we can then manage that work in addressing the issues that have been highlighted as a result of the mapping exercise. The other part of that mapping work is that it will also be shared with the local authorities, health boards and other stakeholders within local areas to support them in the work that they're taking forward with their own local strategies and their own local action plans. So it will help to provide them with a wealth of information around not only what the professionals think is there and what is available, but also what parents and carers and also those with autism within the area have identified as being issues that need to be addressed. So it will give us a much more comprehensive picture of what there is, what the gaps are, and how that can then be addressed. And part of the autism funding that we've set aside is to allow us to address some of the issues that come from the mapping exercise in itself. On the one-stop shops, you're right in saying that Glasgow and Edinburgh's up and running. There are 6 additional ones, 3 of which are already up and running, 2 of which will be shortly, and the Perth one opens today. They're provided as resources for individuals, whether they be professionals, parents or carers, or individuals with autism to approach. It's a resource where they can get information about what services are available that are known of, what sort of training can be provided to parents and carers, training and support to professionals as well. I've, for example, some of my own constituents I've referred on to the one-stop shop in Dunfermline, who also do home visits to come out and do assessment work and support within individuals' homes as well. So it's there as a resource which allows someone post-diagnosis to get the type of support that might be necessary to assist them in making a choice about what services could help to support them, or for their parent or carer to get more information about what they should be doing and what support's available to them in addressing any issues that they might highlight.
I think that gets me quite clear in my head over the process. The mapping exercise is almost fully complete. That will identify the level of service available across the country. It will identify where services could be improved, where there are maybe gaps, and that will feed directly into the local strategies. Now, using the funding available, when you exclude the 1.5 million per annum set aside for funding, there's 8.9 million left over in the 4-year strategy. Can we assume that that 8.9 million pounds will feed directly into the results of that mapping exercise in terms to identify where the gaps are?
Not all of the funding has been held back for the mapping exercise in itself. There's actually areas we've been funding already as part of the strategy. So in terms of the overall financial breakdown, if that would be helpful about where we're at with the £13.4 million we set aside, there was a total spend in 2011-12 of £2.5 million, then £3.6 million in 2011-13. And between 2013 to 2015, we've already committed £4.97 million to a range of initiatives that have already been taken forward just now and will over the next 2 years, which leaves some £2.2 million from the fund between now and 2015 still being available. A large part of that is going to be going towards the work that goes on from the mapping exercise in helping to address some of the areas that have been identified as part of that process.
That's important clarity. So money has not been put on hold awaiting the results of the mapping exercise. Initially I thought it was 1.5 million per annum with everything else being held over until the mapping exercise was complete, but more than that on an annual basis has been spent. So that's helpful to know. Can I ask you then, given the fact that monies are being spent in fairly significant sums just now, in terms of some of the aspirations of the autism strategy, for example, we've been looking for an improvement in the removal of short-term barriers such as delayed diagnosis in terms of autism and delayed intervention. So once diagnosis is complete, actually putting a plan in place for the person with autism. Have some of those barriers been removed, or has progress been made to speed this process up?
There are probably two parts to that. One of the things that we've been doing with some of the funding that we've allocated over the last year and a half is to identify exactly what have been some of the barriers to early diagnosis, and also what support's needed post-diagnosis. So we've been funding the Autism Achieves Alliance, which is NHS Lothian in partnership with the University of Edinburgh and Queen Margaret University. They've undertaken research to identify what the barriers are to individuals getting diagnosed in the first place, what can be done to reduce the waiting times for individuals to get diagnosed. And what we're now doing is that they've developed an action plan which they're now taking forward, which is looked at the whole issue across Scotland. Part of that is that there are issues around process. So people get referred on to one person, then on to another person, on to another person before a diagnosis is eventually arrived at. So we're dealing with some of the issues. They're dealing with some of the issues around process as part of the action plan. And the other issue that's been identified as a major inhibitor is the number of staff who are qualified and able to actually make a diagnosis. So, for example, we're providing this year, we're providing some £300,000 to NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde in order to increase capacity amongst our staff who can actually make a diagnosis, in order to allow for quicker diagnosis and to reduce the waiting times for individuals to receive that service. So it's been about part process and also capacity, and some of the funding which we're providing is to help to address some of that issue. So that will help to feed into increasing the speed at which an individual will actually receive a diagnosis and reduce the waiting times as a result of that.
So two aspects of that, almost like an unclear referral process where the individual is referred between different clinicians or groups for diagnosis, and then having qualified staff that can reliably make an evidence-led diagnosis. So are there any national targets around, say, a parent wishes, goes to the GP with their kid and goes, I'm worried about my child. I would like to have him or her tested in relation to being on the autism spectrum. What are the expectations around that patient journey? So if it was in Glasgow, where I represent, are there national targets around that? I understand there's issues with the process which the national strategy is trying to fix. I appreciate there's issues in relation to sufficient qualified staff, which the national strategy is trying to fix. But in terms of the patient journey, what are the expectations of the patient journey at that point?
I think it'd be fair to say that when the autism strategy was being developed, the key area that was identified around diagnosis was actually adults and the delay that they can experience in actually receiving a diagnosis. That was much more problematic than it was for children, in that the process was quicker and appeared to be clearer as well. So the work that we've been undertaking as part of that through the strategy and the work that the Autism Achieve Alliance have been taking forward is focusing very much on how we can improve the system, in particular around adult diagnosis, to speed up that particular process. There isn't a target as in someone should be, if they're referred, should be diagnosed within that particular time frame as such. But what there is an expectation that the pathway will be significantly improved as a result of the process improvements and also increasing capacity amongst the qualified staff. I think it'd be fair to say as well, given that this is the early stages of the strategy, it may be something we can look at as we go forward, given that it is a 10-year strategy. But at this stage, the priority has been about trying to address issues around the actual process to make that clearer and more simplified and more comprehensive where necessary, but at the same time making sure we've got the right staff in the right place who have the necessary skills in order to make the diagnosis at an early stage. And as I say, the most of the research was indicating that the real area of difficulty was for those adults who remained undiagnosed and the delay that they could experience as a result.
That's helpful. Final question, Minister. There's always a debate at our committee in relation to whether there's enough targets or too many targets, and if everything is a target, do targets become meaningless? I'm not going to explore that road further, whether there should or shouldn't be a target. I'm more interested to know how yourself as Public Health Minister would seek to monitor the patient experience for adults with autism to see if we are getting that care and treatment pathway improved. So how would that be done as part of this 10-year strategy?
What should become evident is that the waiting times for individuals looking for a diagnosis should decrease significantly, and we should have more specialist staff who are actually able to provide a diagnosis as well. So improvement in access and improvement in time frames as well should demonstrate that. But the autism strategy is not something that we've, as you'll appreciate, that we've published and aren't monitoring. We've set up the reference group, who is made up a range of stakeholders from government, third sector and others, and individuals with autism who are responsible for looking at the approach we're taking with the various recommendations set out in the strategy. Their responsibility is to look at what action is necessary to take forward each of those recommendations. They have created 6 subgroups which are all focusing on particular areas which go across a range of different recommendations in the strategy, but may be associated with one another and are taking that work forward. So, for example, the reference group is monitoring the work that's been undertaken in order to reduce waiting times and improving the level of diagnostic staff that's available and diagnostic services that are available. And they report to government on the progress that's been made in these areas. And if there are areas where there needs to be further improvements or changes, then I would expect a reference group to to refer that matter to ministers to look at what we need to do in order to address any issues that may arise. And it should also say that the subgroups have got a whole range of different people from different sectors on them as well. So some of them are chaired by and led by folk from the third sector as well, who've got a specialism in particular areas, or their services have got a specialist experience in that, in helping to support the delivery of the recommendations within the strategy. So in this area, this is a good example of an area where I would expect the subgroup that are looking at this area to advise the reference group if there are issues that have to be addressed, and for the reference group to refer that to ministers if there's any action that we then have to take.
Thank you.
Clarification of the investment, what was it, 185,000 for the diagnostic capacity to
There's a range of different on diagnostic.
Diagnostic and
okay.
You know,
we have what do you call it? We're doing there's £45,000 which is on diagnostic training, which is stage 2 of the waiting list work that we're doing. There is diagnostic support, which is £300,000, which is for Greater Glasgow and Clyde as well. So there's also some further areas. Yep, there was the work that we provided to look at what had to be done around the waiting list issue. There was £250,000 was spent on looking what the problems were, trying to identify what the issues were and what needed to be done in order to address them as well.
It was in particular, thanks Minister, that was in particular the Glasgow Clyde figure. I was interested from a constituency point of view. What is the current waiting time now then?
I don't have the exact time frame for each health board or even at a national level, because the Alliance who've been taking forward that work have developed an action plan. I don't know if, Jean, if you can say what the waiting times are.
I couldn't give you an average waiting time at all. That work is, they've just finished phase 1 and we're moving into phase 2. We know that in some areas, when we had the previous autism strategy 2002 to 2006, at that time there were waiting lists that were on average 2 to 3 years across the country, and those were taken down to nothing, and then they gradually built up again. My understanding is that the waiting lists are not of that scale this time around at all, but what happens is when you begin the journey from the point of referral, it can take quite a while to get to an outcome. That's the bigger issue than waiting to start, which is why the AAA are doing the work that they are to break down the bureaucracy.
Yeah. I'm just trying to get the sense of investing, you know, in terms of precious resources. If you're going to invest a scale of money to address diagnostics, then if we don't know the exact time that people are waiting, is it just too long that they're waiting? It's drifted back up to the levels of 2002, 2006, or is it short of that?
Short of that, we've got the AAA team have been round every health board and have clarified what their waiting times are. They've had face-to-face meetings with every diagnostic team, so we could give the committee that information separately from now.
Baseline, so
yes.
You know, so again that we can measure progress. And what is the ambition then? Is it to get it back to the improvement that we had in 2006.
We can ask the Alliance if for some of that detail, and we can share that with the committee if that would be helpful as well, because they've been leading in that piece of work for us, and that would give you where they see things at the present moment, and also an understanding of where we're trying to get to as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's fine. And then Richard Lyle, followed by Annette.
Good morning, Minister. Can you tell me, basically it's been suggested the diagnosis of children is improving. Would you agree with that comment?
There have been improvements made, and when we were consulting on the development of the strategy, the area that was flagged up as being where there were particular issues around diagnosis was around adults who were waiting much longer and having difficulty in being able to make access to diagnostic services.
That was my next question, actually. There remains a high number of adults with undiagnosed ASD. Basically, can I ask you, how many children do we believe in Scotland have ASD? And have we any clue of undiagnosed adults?
There will probably not be we have so many people diagnosed with X, there will be prevalence levels. which, if it would be helpful, we could provide to the committee. We could indicate to you there's prevalence. Some of the increasing levels that I often hear people saying to me, it appears to be there are more people now with autism than there were 10 or 20 years ago. A big part of that has been around improvements in diagnosis and recognition of that. And the better that we get to the understanding of the autism, then we improve the way in which people are diagnosed. So there have been historically a lot of people who had autism who would not have been diagnosed because it wasn't properly recognised or properly understood. So advances have helped that, and I think that's what's led to our understanding. It's about, on average, it's about 1 in 100 individuals may have autism.
I would agree with your last comment that, a number of years ago people never heard of this word or didn't know what ASD was. And my next question basically is the continuing poor public and professional perception and knowledge of ASD. We all try to bring up our children. When you become a parent, it's certainly basically a situation where you're dealing with a day-to-day child, and people in the public don't realise what a child with ASD has and how things can go off. I remember seeing a play a couple of weeks ago about an autistic child, and that was very informative. So what steps are we taking to inform the public? Are we doing any sort of campaign, any sort of publicity in order to ensure that the public know, and also that people can recognise possibly that maybe their child requires, basically to be tested?
I think the issue as well with autism is that because it's a spectrum, someone can be in a different point of that spectrum and function at an entirely different level, and it's a very individualised condition as well, and how it may manifest itself and how it may present itself in different circumstances. I think one of the most important things I feel for families who may have an autistic child is to make sure that the families have as much information and support as possible in supporting their son or daughter. Maybe just to give you an example, I was at an event last year at the Pyle Care Centre where we had provided funding through the Carers Information Strategy to help to support carers. And part of that was to provide training for parents and carers of children with autism. So there's funding being used from different parts for that type of work, rather than just the autism strategy funding. And what it did was it provided training around parents being aware of a greater awareness of the type of trigger factors that might have an impact on their child and their behaviour. And one of the parents was telling me the story of her own experience, that any time she went to a shopping centre with her son, had real difficulties because of the environment. But no one at any point had actually told her there are actually strategies you can use to actually help to address that and to minimise that and to manage that. And part of this training provided her with an insight into that, and she was saying it made a difference almost overnight as a result. So some of the work that's been done by the one-stop shops is around providing that type of advice and support to parents, and where they can get that advice and support around some of these issues to help to support them in the role they've got as a carer and as a parent as well. We don't have a national programme around raising awareness. As I'm sure you appreciate, public information campaigns are very expensive, and we have to make a decision on where do we feel we can get the best impact from the resource we have alongside the strategy. And at this stage we haven't launched a public information programme, but what we are looking to do as part of the strategy is to increase awareness amongst professionals, parents and carers, individuals with autism, and using a number of different ways in which to try and achieve that. It may be that as we go forward, it's something that we can consider in the future, But at this stage, we don't have a specific commitment to having a public information programme as such.
My last question, Convener, like yourself, I've dealt with over the years, and I have seen it more and more, people coming to me with problems. And I know we have the 10-year strategy and all the health issues now. And the Convener may draw me back in regards to the next question I'm going to ask you. What steps are we taking? More people are coming to politicians, councillors, etc. about their child has this, and what steps are going to be taken at school. So what steps does your department have, along with the education authorities, in order to progress and ensure that people who are coping with ASD, and I admire every one of them, and basically children who are excellent but require this wee bit of help at school, what steps, is this based within the strategy or not?
Well, there are a couple of different aspects to that. The first aspect is that, as I mentioned, that we are working with local authorities to develop their own local strategies and their action plans. A number of the, which will obviously include education, although in most local authority areas it's social work who have the lead around ASD. But what we're doing with them is that we've provided some resource to them to help them to develop their local strategies. We expect to have all of them submitted by November of this year, or to receive a copy of their strategy by November of this year, to see what action they're taking at a local level. And part of that is better coordination within schools and the other support services, whether it be social work or others, who can assist in the supporting of that particular pupil. The other thing we're doing is providing capacity for teachers to be able to get training around working with children who have autism, or if they've got an autistic child in their class. And some of the work that we're doing just now, which is due to be lodged this autumn, has been taken forward by Autism Scotland, I think, is part of some of the experience they've had from Struan School, and the resource that they've developed online to help to support teachers in classes, the toolkit that I referred to in my opening comments. That'll be launched this autumn, which is there to allow to help to train teachers and to support teachers where they're working with a child who does have autism. So it's about helping to make sure that local authorities have plans in place to better coordinate the support that they provide at a local level, but alongside that helping to support the teachers with the necessary training that they require in working with pupils who may have ASD as well. I wouldn't like anyone to think that it's an ideal situation out there, but some of the foundation work we're doing in this area, I think, will allow us to build on that as we go forward with this strategy over the next 8 or so years.
Thanks, Convener.
And Annette Millen.
An issue that's raised with me often in many conditions, mainly health-related, but I think not least in autism, is the transitional time between children's services and going into adult life. Have you got measures in place to ensure a smooth transition into service provision for people with autism, particularly young people who are actually leaving full-time education?
Transition for a whole range of individuals with conditions tends to be an area where difficulties can arise. What we're doing is we're doing some work just now as part of the strategy with Transition Scotland, who I believe are based in Glasgow, and looking at developing guidance for the management of transition, whether that be from health or whether it be in education, but to help to support the transition of individuals with autism from one service to the next service, and to help to manage that better, because particularly given the nature of the condition for different individuals, changes like that can be quite unsettling and can cause challenges in itself. So part of the strategy's work is around improving transition, and that work has been taken forward just now and has been developed as part of trying to improve the way in which transition arrangements are made for individuals.
That look at the sort of quality of life that these people can expect, and not just their sort of medical or their physiological situation.
We should take a holistic approach, given the nature of, because autism is one of these conditions that is very individualised in how it will present, and if it operates in a very prescribed fashion, then the reality is it's not going to work effectively. So it's going to have to take a holistic approach. And the work that Transition Scotland will take forward will help to support that and to make sure we've got a consistency as where we can with 32 different local authorities and 14 territorial health boards, as much a consistency as we can in how they manage transition from one service into the next service.
That's helpful, thanks. The another issue was raised with us by the round table that we had in March was self-directed support, and how you would incorporate the recommendations, that considerations given to the specific supports needed for more able individuals with ASD, and to develop the user and carer capacity to enable them to take part in planning processes and planning for their own condition. And will they be will people with autism be represented in, on the strategy implementation group, for instance, of SDS, and just the SDS bill reference group? Are they going to be actively involved in that?
Well, for self-directed support, should be as accessible to individuals with autism as it should be for anybody else, and to where they're in a position to make an informed choice, to be able to do so as to how they wish to have their social care provision managed, whether they want to take control of that or whether they want the local authority to control that, or a combination of both. We have a specific event that's taking place, I think it's this month, which is around SDS and an area of autism. And my understanding is that it will be that's largely targeted at parents and carers and those with autism, in looking at SDS and to feed into some of the work we're doing around the regulations and the guidance around SDS as well, which will help to support that. So I see SDS as being an opportunity for individuals with autism, as it is for any other person who may be subject to a social care assessment.
Was a fear amongst some people who thought that because of the nature of autism, these people might kind of fall off the radar.
In the event we've got later this month, will allow individuals with autism, their parents and carers to give their input directly into some of the work that's been taken forward in support of the Self-Directed Support Act coming into force next year. Yeah.
Glad you've put that on the record, thanks.
Yes. Supplementary?
A very brief supplementary, Minister. Can I just get some clarity in relation to self-directed support? And the Minister may understand why when I ask this question. Anyone with autism or who's got a family with autism who seek to use self-directed support, can you confirm that there's no compulsion on individuals to take personalised budgets or go through the personalisation process, and that local authorities can continue to provide support following any assessment? There's not a compulsion to go through the personalisation process. That's only one element of self-directed support, because in some parts of the country that's been pushed as self-directed support. It's just to get that clarity, because there may be some families who have family members with autism who may be going through that process, and it's just to be clear on that.
I'm conscious that around self-directed support there are those who are extremely enthusiastic about self-directed support because they want to have more control over how their care is provided for them, and they want to have that level of control. While there are also those who may be less vocal, who have got some anxieties about what that may mean for them if they don't want to manage their care situation. Self-directed support is about choice. An individual can take as much control of their care arrangement as they wish, or they can leave it to the local authority to manage in the way in which many local authorities do at the present moment. So all it does at the end of the actual assessment process is it doesn't change the assessment process in itself. All it means is at the end of the process you are presented with 4 options, and you can choose to have as much control or as little control as you want. There is nothing mandatory about it. There's nothing that someone's compelled to. There is nobody with a particular disability excluded from it. It's purely a matter of choice as to what that individual feels best suits their individual circumstances.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Can I pick up on a point about transition in terms of the further education sector, which supports lots of young people with autism, special needs, stroke, and certainly in my area in the west of Scotland, some of that group will be attending colleges for 5, 10, 15 years in some cases. So it's an important element of that transition from mainstream schooling. And I was wondering whether there was any discussions between yourselves and ministerial colleges about any unintended consequences about the change in direction and employment outcomes, which that group of people will not fit. And I was just wondering if there's any discussion between yourself and your colleagues and with responsibility for further education to ensure that there is no unintended outcomes here in terms of displacement with young people with special needs.
I think maybe two parts to that. One is the transition within the education part of itself, and then going from the educational establishment possibly into employment. Is that? Well,
the problem is, and I can understand completely the focus of young people going to college. The government has put a strong focus on young people now going into employment. Many of the people who manage that transition from mainstream education go into further education for 2-3 days a week. They sign up for different courses over the years, and in some cases it can extend to 20 years. So it has been an environment that has supported them one way or the other out with the home, offered inclusion to an extent, and whatever. And I'm concerned that given the new focus, which I'm not challenging, you know, the new focus of people in employment, they don't fit that. Will this lead to an unintended consequence of squeezing that group of young people out of our colleges? And if that is the case, then how will they be supported in the wider community, and what is there to support them and provide that activity of 2 or 3 days a week that they would be out of the home. So if they're back in the home, it's not good for them. There's going to be an increased pressure on carers, and that's the, you know, I quite run through my concern on that issue.
Sure. I understand where you're coming from in terms of the changing nature of the student base within our colleges and those who may have been in courses for long periods of time that may have autism as well. I think a key part was I think, and this is around, is helping to improve the employability opportunities for individuals with autism. The Count Us In report, which the National Autistic Society launched in Parliament here a few months ago, I think was a very good example of a desire to see the improving the opportunities for individuals with autism to be able to go into employment. So it may be that some of the individuals found themselves in colleges for extended periods of time because they had difficulty in being able to move into the employment market in itself and to gain employment as part of that issue. One of the things that is being addressed in the strategy is the issue around employability. Just now the government are reviewing its national employability strategy, which, if I recall correctly, was launched back in, I think, 2006, and that's now been reviewed and updated. And the reference group have actually set up a subgroup who are specifically feeding into the national employability strategy. So there's a specific element around supporting individuals with autism and recognising some of the issues around autism for employers to address and to help to support them to increase their opportunities to gain employment. So I think...
Are they represented in that?
Yes, it would include so those who may be in a situation where if they're present in the FE sector and it would be better for them to move into employment, it gives them the opportunity to get the support that's necessary to help to support them in gaining employment as well. So, so that particular subgroup that was set up is looking at that issue to see what we can do to try and help to improve the opportunities for individuals with autism to be able to move into employment.
But colleges will be measured now.
Yeah.
On the success about getting people into employability.
Yeah.
So the concern, it may be, you know, misplaced concern, but the issue is that you're not going to carry a group of people that are going to get you a negative place on the league table if your responsibility is to get people into employment. I don't know whether these groups help address this, but there's a significant population of young people with special needs in our colleges. They have been there for some time, and I'm just concerned that there may be an unintended consequence of that. And I don't know, happy for you to come back, to explain how that issue has been at least recognised and addressed. I think it was also an issue when we had evidence from the autism group that they accepted that this was a concern.
I think maybe two parts to that. One is the issue about improving employability opportunities for individuals with autism and tackling some of those barriers. Some of the funding we've provided through the Autism Development Fund has been to some programmes at a local level, which are about helping to improve employability for individuals with autism. But I think it's important at a national level that we give clear leadership to that. So that's why we have this particular group who are focusing in on the present review of the employability strategy at a national level, so it's part of national policy and helping to improve opportunities. I think the second part may be around this. So to reassure you, it's an issue which is on the agenda and has been addressed at the present time as part of the review that's taking place, and that's feeding into John Swinney's department that are leading that particular review of the employability strategy. So we have a group that are already looking at that particular issue. The other point I'm taking is the issue around the opportunities for individuals with autism within our FE sector and being able to do complete courses there as well. Is that correct?
I think that's that becomes the issue.
Yeah.
If there's not a job for them, which with the greatest will in the world we would all wish that for them, that's difficult in a difficult employment market anyway. If there's no job for them and no place at the college, then whose budget's going to be hit?
Yeah. No, I understand.
That's the issue.
And I think that's why for example, the Counters In report that the National Autistic Society published is being considered by the Strategies Reference Group in looking at what further measures need to be taken in order to improve employability opportunities for individuals with autism. And part of the subgroup that's been set up to address some of that issue is feeding directly into what has to be provided in the new employability strategy at a national level to address some of the issues that have been highlighted for individuals with autism as well. So I think a key part to this is to improve the opportunity for individuals with autism to gain employment, whether it be through the FE sector or whether it be through just through direct employment themselves, not going through the FE sector. We need to make sure there's an issue there about individuals with autism not being able to secure the same employment opportunities as others, and we need to address what those issues are. And the best way for us to do that is, rather than having something completely standalone for autism in itself, although there's some things we're doing through the funding that we're providing to organisations to support that, is that as part of our national employability strategy, is that clearly recognises some of the issues that individuals with autism have and what we can do to improve access into the employment market for that group of individuals.
Bob's wanting in on that, and Jane?
And again, with your indulgence, my second supplementary, I think the conversation, I could be wrong, maybe it's slightly cross purposes. I meet a number of people who have autism, but autism is not their main barrier to learning. They've got a variety of learning disabilities, and autism is there as part of the mix. And be very careful what I say. I would never say never to anyone finding themselves into employment. But some people have such profound and complex learning difficulties that employment or paid employment may not really be realistic for a very small minority of people within the country. Some of them may use further education colleges or other places as a socially enriching part of their lives and the quality of their lives. So I think what I would ask, not necessarily for answer today, Minister, but would be just in the general mix that we make sure that with those who have complex learning needs, of which autism is part of that there are still a range of avenues they can go down for which it could be a further education college, but with the best will in the world, the employability outcome may be an unrealistic outcome for them, but there's other enriching things for them as human beings and for society to allow them to do that, and hopefully that's helpful, Convener. That's kind of where I am in terms of the thrust. Yeah. Sorry.
No, sorry.
Bob has just articulated what I was going to say, so I'm happy just to go with his question. Yeah.
It's two for the price of one.
No, I appreciate where you're coming from on a particular issue, and I know individuals myself who dip into FE courses, sort of idea for particular purposes, maybe around ADL issues, and and the benefits they can get from some of those programmes in themselves. Jean, you wanted to say a particular thing around this?
Just to concur with the point that Mr Doris has made, because one of the subgroups that the Minister's referred to consists of people on the spectrum themselves, and there's another group that's carers. Those that are on the spectrum themselves, in a discussion about employability recently, made that very point. For many, full employment is an aspiration that may be fulfilled, and some of the funding that's been given has been, for example, for people who are self-employed. My enterprise in Lothian being a recent example where people have ideas that they want to turn into their own careers, but they don't want or feel able to be part of a bigger organisation. So self-employment and advocacy around enabling that has been useful and helpful. For others, I can think of a young woman who is particularly able on many aspects of her personality and functioning, but she would say, I don't want full employment. It would lead to mental health issues for me. I'm happy with meaningful occupation, is how she would describe fulfilment of an aspiration in her life. And that takes the form of having an allotment where she makes her own vegetables, and she's a bit of a foodie, and she turns that into enjoyment of just making food and sharing it with others, and that gives her the kind of fulfilment that others might get through full employment.
Drew Smith, I think you had a wee supplementary on this, but this is your question as well, Drew.
Right, okay. Well, I was going to actually come back to the issue of that Richard Lyle raised around around public information and understanding of the whole spectrum, the conditions on it. I mean, it seems to me there's a bit of an injustice in this, in that if we accept that we have perhaps not served people with conditions on the autistic spectrum in the past particularly well, and we've made a lot of progress in improving diagnosis, improving the services and supports that are available to them. But I was quite struck by one of the comments that was made when we had the discussion around employability for those people at the evidence session, where they said really the employment barriers faced by many people with autistic conditions would only really be broken when the understanding improved within the population as a whole. They said that there is work that we could do and we could be supported to do to improve the employability for these people and to encourage them to do all the things that we would want to be done. But realistically, unless there is a step change at population level and how people understand and appreciate the condition and see beyond the condition, then you're not going to get any major breakthrough in terms of their employability. So I appreciate what the Minister said in terms of, a public campaign is not on the agenda at present, there isn't one going. What would the mechanics of that be, though? Would you see it as being, these sort of things should be planned for by Health Scotland goes away and thinks about them, the organisations in the sector and interested people think about what they might want to do and then approach you? How would we get to the point where we try to make that kind of change, except when it's maybe not for this year or next year, but it's maybe an aspiration of where we need to be once we've improved the services, how we then improve the understanding beyond it?
Maybe just picking up on a specific example you've given around the issue of employability, I think rather than a broad-based public information programme, the way in which to tackle that issue around employers is to have a targeted approach. And that is working with employers' organisations and employers in that sector to have a better understanding of autism, which can help to break down the barrier. So I think part of any public information campaign, if it's broad-brushed, it may be that employers just feel as though it's just raising awareness of autism, but it may not necessarily address the issues of concern or misunderstanding they have about employing someone with autism. So I think part of the work, for example, around trying to improve employability opportunities for individuals with autism is working with the organisations who are directly engaging with employers around breaking down their misconceptions about employing individuals with autism. And some of the funding which we're providing just now, there's a range of areas around employment where we've got, with the National Autistic Society, some of our councils were funding programmes to help to support them in employability issues as well. Some of it's around training issues as well. So I think we have to, my experience in terms of just, there are obviously a range of different public health, public information programmes that we have. my experience is that very often you have to be quite targeted in who you're trying to get that message across to. There can be benefit from just a broad information programme in terms of public awareness in general. A good example of that, I think, in the last 10 years or so would be the See Me campaign in the mental health sector, in helping to break down some of the barriers and stigma associated with mental health. But I think around employability, any information programme should be quite targeted at the business sector or employer sector in order to address any misconceptions that they actually have.
Thank you very much. I think my concern though is, I think if you think around the See Me campaign and the campaign that's going on around mental health, the big things that they have been able to get across is the idea that there is a whole range of conditions and the effect that particular conditions will have on people and how that changes, and also the idea of prevalence. And it seems to me that those are two areas where there is very limited understanding amongst people. We touched on that very early on about, you know, the perception that the number of people affected by autism is rising, but actually that's probably to do with improving diagnosis. But I think amongst all of us in general, we don't really have a very full understanding of, well, how many, you know, until we, because there's a danger in diagnosing a group of people with a, you know, labelling them with a condition and then treating them as other, and then dealing with that through, well, we'll have targeted employability support, and I would support everything that the Minister is saying and doing. But unless you put that in a broader context for people, then they're never going to make a breakthrough you know, beyond those particular employers that are interested in supporting people because they're good employers.
I think you know, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some form of public information programme at some point in the future. What I do recognise is that I think as part of the what that we're undertaking and getting the foundations of the strategy right for building on it and going forward over the next 8 or 8.5 years, is that it may be something that comes at a later stage, because they do tend to be very costly. It's difficult from my perspective that if I have an individual coming to my surgery who's in difficulty in just getting into diagnostic services, if I say, well, our funding priority might be a public information programme, I think we have to get some of the basics right here, and the priority and the strategy is to get those basics right, to get that foundation right. And some of the work that may come off that. And it may be that at a later stage then that we can look at whether there's a public information programme should be part of it. It may be the type of See Me model might be a useful model. Obviously prevalence of mental health is much greater than it is of autism. It might be a model that would lend itself to this particular field, and it may be that that it's something that could be taken forward by one of the national autistic organisations on behalf of government. I think there's a variety of models that could be used in looking at taking it forward. I think it's so I'd be very open to that, but I think it may be something that's a bit further down the line in order to make sure we get some of the basics right and address some of the fundamental barriers that are there at the present moment, that can help us to make an improvement for both individuals and families themselves. But it may be that at a later stage in the strategy it's something that we should look at, yes.
No other questions from the committee? Can I thank the Minister and your colleagues for being with us this morning and the evidence provided. Thank you very much. Thank you. We now go into private session as previously agreed.